grand evening. Yeah, I had a headache. Took my turban off. And I've got some new hats too. And I'm going to be sporting at some point. This kind of late post, it goes. I suppose in some ways I want to be clear. When I set up DRC, which is Done Ramping Coalition, its focus was on, as an example, descendants of or descendants and survivors of the transatlantic slave trade from English-British point of view. That's how it began. Those were the people that were that was the focus. So it's people from the Caribbean, which is another fiction. There's loads of them all over the place. Caribbean. Again, it's something that was created by the UK Crown Corporation under the doctrine of discovery, in order to complete certain operations which were about devolving and dissolving the rights, hereditaments, inheritances and birthright of indigenous peoples across the planet. Now, that was 2 years ago when I set that up, and it's transformed so much. Well, the group has too. It's grown in size, in numbers, and in focus. The notion of survivors and descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, I suppose it is clear that that's a myth for a start. It transpires. It's a myth, it's a lie, it's a fraud. Lots of work to be done around that, but the implications are quite striking and phenomenal. But I want to go back to that principle, that knowledge, that idea that melanated people from the Caribbean in particular have a particular relationship with what I would call back then the English, the British. There was a particular type of relationship that people had from the Caribbean were having, that historically have had, in comparison to, say, and the Windrush generation who came here after the Second World War, throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and to a degree during the 80s too, as a backdrop, so if you like, in terms of migrant groups then that have come to these islands post Second World War, then the Caribbean being the first, and then it's grown into. Then there were the Indians and Pakistanis, Kashmiris, people from the Indian subcontinent. Then it sort of, throughout the 70s and the 80s again, and throughout the 90s also. Then, and in the middle of all of that, you've got sort of Ugandan Asians that came as migrant community groups. I'm going to leap forward to the early noughties, I think it was, and there was Argentinians that come back. There were South Africans coming here. In the middle of all of that, whilst that was going on, you've got Polish, Afghani, Estonia, Latvia. As the Eastern Bloc countries started to dissolve and change and get. This phrase, get religion, but get democracy, become democratized, or this surge, this feel, this desire to become democratic, which I now can sort of see isn't necessarily the idea of the people of those lands, the people that live there, the people of those nations. It's usually inspired then, let's say, by external forces. So what am I trying to say about that? Okay, so we have there's a train of my thought again. It's really quite complex. I'm finding it quite complicated. But I'm to change the way that I think, or how I've thought about everything, into a new paradigm in which I am discovering the depths of the lie. It's one thing to discover that you've been lied to, but then the depths of the lie and the implications of the lie upon who has rights and responsibilities and obligations then. So yeah, DRC was about people from the Caribbean. It's turned into British, and still about melanated peoples, because it seems to me, all right, okay, so what I'm trying to say is that with all the migrant community groups, again, many African ones, and in all the middle of this actually, and across the ages, again through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, there's been a Pan-African, a back to Africa movement within all of this, of which I've embraced and have been part of. And we've got Black History Month, so we've got Black over there, we've got African over there, we've got Caribbean over there, and then it's just dawned on me recently, about a year ago actually, at the time, not long after DRC was set up, about 6 months, 8 months into that, it started to dawn on me about, hang on a minute, this notion of the transatlantic slave trade, about going back to Africa, and at the same time being in I'm gonna call it the UK at the time, or Britain, whatever it was, noticing all these migrant communities arriving in the UK and doing really well for themselves, establishing themselves here, obtaining citizenships of all kinds, UK and British, establishing themselves and their families here, and yet the Windrush generations still struggle to get a foothold here. And what's worse for me is that there are other groups from the African subcontinent, or from the continent of Africa, that now have come here after we've been sold, the people from the Caribbean have been given this notion of African connection and African history, African roots, and African lineage, of which I have to sort of say, nobody from the Caribbean that I've ever spoken to talked about having any family in Africa. Not one. And there ought to be, considering the slave trade was whenever it was. There should be some lineage, there should be some connection, there should be some email address, there should be something. There's nothing. I've not come across any. There's none in my family. I can tell you that for nothing. But at the same time, what I was struck by was that we've got people from various parts of the African continent coming, residing here, making lives, as I said. And now, the history of the people from the Caribbean from the 40s, 50s and 60s, that's been told by people who have not lived it. Yeah, there's a generation, my mum's generation, that are speaking less and less, because they're getting older and older and dying, I suppose, about our history since that time in this country. That seems to be fading away. And there's a new narrative which isn't that doesn't have our voice, doesn't have Caribbean voices in it. Then, okay, I suppose that's what I want to say. Now, this is no disrespect. I accept my connection, my African connection to my African cousins, as I do with my American cousins, as I do with my Australian relatives and ancestors and cousins and family. I recognise that. But we seem to be the only group of people left on the planet that doesn't seem to can't be clear about their homeland. I'm very, very clear. I'm very, very clear. Oh, yes, I am. It's right here on these islands. And I'm not happy about it, but like, documentation is clear. It's absolutely clear. And you've known about it for a long time. And I'm not going to go into that. However, this is a sort of a statement I suppose that I'm making to those people that are not, that look like me but aren't necessarily indigenous to these lands, are recent migrant community members to these lands. Yes, and I'm talking about people from the Indian subcontinent, the African subcontinent, from wherever subcontinent. It's not okay for you to be telling me about my history here in these lands. It's not okay at all, and nor should it be forgotten either. My mum is still here, and my ancestry in these islands goes back before the Second World War, pre-Windrush. So it goes all the way back to James the House of Stuart. That's not to be forgotten. That's not to, and nobody else can speak about that other than those that are the descendants of the line of Jacob, the Jacobites, the Britons, the British, those that hold a allodial title, unalienable rights to these lands, British Moors. So we need to sort of talk about our history. Yes, post the, what's it called again? The boat. Post Windrush, or since Windrush, but also before then. Before Windrush, the 1930s, the 1920s, the early 1900s, the late 1800s, the 1700s, the mid 1700s, at the time of the creation, going back to the 1500s, at the time of the doctrine of discovery, the Noir codes, at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. You need to go back to those times, because that's when we were rocking in Europe. Yeah, we were running everything. It's not that we were running it, we were here. All the systems that are in place at the moment that have been corrupted by what has been described as hybrid human beings, European hybrid human beings, pale-faced Europeans, then, for want of a better phrase, that have come along and corrupted that which was working very, very well, thank you. What reason? You've got to go to look to scriptures for that, or look to your own history. But it's quite clear that is the case. So what I'm saying here, a couple of things really, is that it's time for British Moors, that have a connection, if you like, connected to the Windrush generation, the people whose descendants have come from, because the chances are, the reason why you have come from the Caribbean here is that your forebears were genocided from here to the Caribbean. You were transported to the Caribbean from these islands and from other parts of Europe too, including Germany. There's a place called Hanover in Jamaica, top left-hand bit of the island. And there's been a well-known German population in Jamaica for years. And they are actually white too, but some of them are not. There's some black Germans up there that speak German and that's their heritage. They came from Europe and came to the Caribbean. Not just Jamaica, but all of it, everywhere of the Caribbean, and some ended up on the mainland of the US. There's a video that I've been sent today. Dr. Mumbi, I think her name is, she's an African woman. She's also beginning to acknowledge, she started to confess the fact that, yes, Americans were already there before the time of Columbus. And at the time of Columbus, Columbus writes about the swarthy, melanated, dark brown and copper-coloured skins and nappy hair of the people that were there when he got there. Yeah, and they weren't all living in tents either, and chasing buffalo. Some were not. Make no mistake about it. Until the next time, may your ERP remain strong.